Hi, everyone. It's Don. Um, I was excited to read your reflections on your motivation and engagement sections of the Principles of College Teaching this week. Obviously, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. This is something that I spent time on, both in my research and in my teaching life. It's a big hallmark of my teaching philosophy and what I try to do in my teaching persona. And I write a lot about it, do videos about it, and those kind of things. So I'm really excited to kind of see how all of you interacted with the information this week. First of all, I love the takeaways. The things that you were taking away are things that we wanted you to take away. You get to see some really engaging people, not just me, this week kind of talk about these kinds of things. And I was really glad to see that you took away actionable and practical bits of advice for yourself so that you can make yourselves more engaging for your students. Having said that, there were some really good questions that a lot of you came up with this week, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about them. One of the first questions that came up is, it had to do with, or this is a question a couple of you had, is how much is a factor of the instructor and how much is a factor of the content? In particular, someone had mentioned kind of STEM disciplines and how that content might be harder and there might not be time in class given the pace at which content needs to be covered for students to get all of their learning objectives satisfied, that maybe the instructor doesn't have time to try to focus on being engaging. And another of you said something about how it's really the content. And if you have good content, you're going to be engaging. If you don't have, very exciting content, if you're teaching something, I think the person said computer coding, it's just not going to be engaging no matter who the instructor is. I do think obviously these are both going to be factors. If you have really good content, and as a social psychologist, I think a lot of time I have really good content. I have things that people are going to find inherently interesting, but that's also because I'm interested in them. And I think that information can be inherently interesting to anyone. And I think one of the things that I try to do is try to find ways for people who love the information to help me share that engagement moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some days where it's harder challenge, that it's going to be harder for me to find ways to make that information intrinsically interesting to all of my students. But I try to do that. And I don't think if we're going to spend time teaching it, if we're going to spend time in our curriculum versus all of the other things we could be doing teaching it, that it's going to be something valueless. If it's valuable, I think playing up the value of that information and doing so in an authentic and genuine way and telling my students why that's important for them to learn it and why it's important for me to teach it. This is something that I'm going to try to do in class with my students, or now, in the videos that I'm creating for my students, and the other ways that I can do this. So I do think the instructor is part of it. I do think the content is part of it. I do think we try to maximize our part, right? I can't necessarily change what is important in a social psychology class because the field has made those determinations in a lot of ways, but I can change the way that I present it to the information. So I'm going to focus on what I can control. One of you asked a very astute question. What about when events in your class happen that change the motivation of your students? And the person used the example of grades. So maybe there's a midterm exam and your students do great. Maybe they're not motivated to really invest because they've done all they're going to do. Or maybe there's a student on the border. Now that student is more motivated to learn more. I think what you've got to do is you've got to focus not on those extrinsic factors, right? The grade or the assignment. You focus on the learning. And what I try to do when I'm working with my students is inspire them to think about why they took the course in the first place and why they're doing it now. So right now, I'd say to all of you, you took this course because you wanted to be excellent teachers. So what you're doing now is you're not really trying to accumulate points. You're trying to learn. You're trying to gather information. You're trying to learn techniques in teaching. You're trying to learn about your philosophy. You're trying to learn ways to assess your students' learning, those kinds of things. And that's why you're here. If you're here for the grades, it's going to be hard for me to motivate you. So I think playing up that connection to intrinsic motivation, that the person is taking the class because there's something in that class they found valuable, is going to help you get past some kinds of factors. Having said that, at the end of the semester, when my students only need a certain number of points on that final exam to get the grade that they want, it's hard to engage them because they're conserving energy. They're using their energy in strategic ways to try to focus on this other class over here where they've got to get a higher grade maybe in the final exam to get the grade they want. It's hard to do that. But I try to thoroughly throughout the semester remind my students about why they're there. Another of you had a question. I thought this was a great one too. How much time do you spend learning new and interesting information for your class? And can this lead to pressure, stress, and burnout? Yeah, it absolutely can. And one of the things that I do after I've prepped my class kind of that first time is I wait for organic opportunities to help me with my class. So when I teach general psychology, right, there's so many different topics in there. There's basically 15 weeks of class with one topic per week. So social psychology one week, abnormal psychology another week, health psychology another week, brain and behavior another week. When I see something that would be a perfect fit, I include it. So a lot of it is not me looking for stuff. It's stuff just showing up. A colleague mentions an article. I see something on a listserv. I see something on a Facebook post that I say, that would be perfect for my class. I go to a conference. That would be perfect for my class. So I let my class build organically. I don't put a lot of pressure on myself. Now, early on, when you're building that class from scratch, it's going to be a little bit harder to do and a little bit more pressure. But I try not to put too much pressure on myself to do that. I try to let the class build itself as I find content. And again, this is something we're asking your colleagues for what they do, the most interesting thing they do, the coolest study they teach. This is going to really help your class. Another of you asked a great question about, I said we should prepare ourselves cognitively and emotionally to teach. And we had a study where award-winning teachers prepare themselves cognitively and emotionally to teach. And one of you asked, well, don't we need to be trained to do that? Yeah, I think you do. And this is why we're having conversations like this. And I think this is something that works really, really well with mentoring. And maybe this is something we'll spend more time on in one of our synchronous Zoom meetings toward the end of the semester. But this is something where you really got to decide who you want to be as a teacher. How are you going to present yourself? How are you going to present your material? It's not just knowing the material being enough. And I think getting some guidance, I think seeing models, thinking about teachers who have done that well and what they've done well. I think attending those professional development workshops. I think about being metacognitive, about what makes a teacher very, very engaging to you, and what makes a teacher less engaging to you are going to be helpful in this regard. So I think a lot of this is going to rely on intention and devoting time to thinking about this metacognitively. But yeah, I do think these are conversations we need to have a lot more. And these aren't conversations that I necessarily had when I was learning to teach. These are conversations that came later. But I love this question, and it's one we're going to continue to deal with. Love this one. How do we engage when our students aren't in charge of their own education? So the question the student used was talking about, well, what if the parents, are compelling that decision? What if the student thinks an advisor or professor is propelling that conversation and those course selections and those kinds of things? I'll go one further. We do Engage the Sage videos. And one of the things that I talked about Engage the Sage, and you saw me talk about it a little bit this week, is playing up intrinsic motivation and letting students know you don't have to be here. And my sister is a high school teacher and said, well, they do have to be here. What do we do then? And I'm actually going to point you to that Engage the Sage video where we take on that topic. But to give you a little bit of an overview, I think this is where you play up to that student the value of what they're doing, to all of your students, the value of what they're doing. So no matter how they got there, there's a reason to be there, and there's good reasons to be there, and there's good reasons to engage in the information, there's good reasons to engage in the assignments, there's good reasons to learn the things in your class. And I think focusing on that and emphasizing that is going to be really helpful when the student is not necessarily, or doesn't perceive themselves as being necessarily in charge of all of their educational decisions. That's a great question. I love the way that y'all are leading into these questions, making them very, very sophisticated and very, very nuanced, because these are great conversations we can be having. All right, the big final question, and this is a big final question, is why is there so much emphasis on teaching evaluations? Why do these get emphasized so much in tenure promotion and merit evaluation and hiring decisions and those kind of things? And this is a wonderful question, because the student notes they're not really a measure of teacher effectiveness, and they're not. Teaching evaluations, at the end of the semester, you give your students the opportunity to rate your class and provide their feedback. And what they measure is customer satisfaction, which is not the same as teacher effectiveness. Teacher effectiveness is really how much they learned. I think the reason that these get so much attention, well, there's a couple of reasons. The first is that there's the perception that they're fair, right? And they're not necessarily fair. And research shows there's a lot of inherent biases that go into teacher evaluations. And interestingly, the biggest predictor of teacher evaluations in my reading of literature is the grade the student is expecting to get. So there are ways to potentially game the teaching evaluations, where a difficult course, where it's harder to get a good grade, might be rated less well. Sexism, racism, xenophobia, those kind of things may show up in teaching evaluations as well, where if you're not a majority group member, you may not get evaluations quite as high, and the literature shows that in a lot of ways. But what they do is they provide a number. right? So on the T-vals, the teaching evaluation system that we use, it provides a number for teaching effectiveness. And what people think is that they're being fair when they compare one instructor to another instructor, and instructor A got a 4.5 and instructor B got a 3.8, then instructor A is a better instructor. Well, instructor A may be teaching, smaller classes of only majors. The content, may be much harder in one of the classes versus the other. And these are all factors that are hard to basically decide how much to weight. And what we can potentially then do is just decide that we're being fair and just applying the numbers. The Teaching and Learning Center basically makes the recommendation that we should only use teaching evaluations for about a third of the evaluation of the instructor's actual effectiveness. And that demonstrations of the student's work, right? What did they do in your class? What did they produce? How did they demonstrate their learning? These might be more valuable. It may be something else where maybe it's not just demonstration of student work, but maybe you have an observation done by a department head or a colleague or someone like that. And these don't often get used because they're scary. For those of you who have had people, observe your teaching, and for those of you in the psychological sciences teaching apprenticeship program, you're going to have people observe your teaching. This is hard. This is scary. You have someone sitting in there, and that could change basically the dynamic of your class. It could raise your anxiety and your stress level. So people don't like those, and they're afraid if I say one bad thing and make one mistake in class, I'm going to get fired. That's not true, but that could be the perception. So there are a lot of ways to potentially have your students learn and demonstrate their learning. And teaching evaluations just tell you how happy they are. And interestingly, I'd heard someone say once that teaching evaluations are asked the people who are least able to tell you how much they learned at the worst possible time. Right? Teaching evaluations get given typically in the last week or two of a semester when students are stressed, when we are stressed, with a lot of stuff going on, they're worried about their grades, they're overloaded. And we ask them, hey, how did I do as a teacher? That might not be the best way to do that, but there might not be an easy alternative. So the short answer to your question is that teaching evaluations get overused because they're easy and we think that they're fair. I'll tell you myself that the worst teaching evaluations in terms of the number on a T-val came in a class where I arguably had the most learning. It was actually recently where I had students in a first year experience class conduct their own research projects, and they did wonderfully. But they didn't like how much work that was, and they thought that I worked them too hard, and that showed up in the numbers that they gave me. So I have wonderful demonstrations of student learning, and I have very low numbers, well, low for me numbers on a teaching evaluation. And that was kind of hard to reconcile. So one of the things that I would recommend for all of you who are trying to make a case that you are an excellent teacher, for hiring committees, for awards, for all kinds of things, is create ways to show evidence of your teaching effectiveness. Keep track of your assignments, keep track of your syllabi, keep examples of student work to show what your students were able to learn, not necessarily how happy they were, but how much they were able to learn when you were teaching them. And I think that's a much better effectiveness rating than are the numbers on a T-val. So these are great questions this week. These are challenging questions. These are deep questions and questions that I couldn't completely answer, but I could give you my perspective on. So I continue to look forward to these every week, and I'm looking forward to having some synchronous meetings with you later this semester. So keep bearing with us, keep working through the material. As always, if you have questions, let's talk, let's connect. You need to talk over the phone or by Zoom. I'm happy to do that because I want to continue to help you along your journey to becoming excellent teachers. So thank you for wonderful questions. I hope all is well.